Have you ever stopped to think about debt? Not your credit card or your mortgage, but the really big numbers. Every single country on Earth is in debt. The United States owes a mind-boggling $38 trillion. Japan is on the hook for $9 trillion. All told, the entire planet owes about $315 trillion. To put that in perspective, that's more than 3 times the value of everything the global economy produces in a year. But here's the weird question that should keep you up at night. If every country owes money, who exactly do they owe it to? If everyone is a borrower, where are all the lenders? The answer is stranger and, frankly, more disturbing than you can imagine. Because when you really follow the money, when you trace the web of who owes what to whom, you find out the world doesn't really owe money to some other planet or a secret group of aliens. The world owes the money to itself. And this wasn't an accident. It was a design. A system built on purpose by 4 men, 4 brilliant bankers, working across 3 different centuries. They created a financial machine where debt can never truly be paid back. A system where governments are encouraged to borrow forever, where the interest on that borrowing flows endlessly from the taxpayers to the top. They designed a perfect trap, and the people who designed it profit from every single payment, every financial crisis, and every government bailout. Now, this isn't some late-night conspiracy theory. This is documented history. The meetings really happened. The contracts still exist. The financial mechanics are a matter of public record. And once you see how they built this machine, piece by piece, you'll finally understand why a $38 trillion debt isn't seen as a problem to be solved. It's the system working exactly as it was intended. Let me introduce you to the 4 architects of this system and the 4 key moments they engineered this debt trap, and why today every government on Earth is caught inside with no obvious way out. Our story begins long before 1694. Back then, kings and queens borrowed money the old-fashioned way. They'd go to wealthy merchants or powerful nobles and ask for a loan, promising to pay it back with a little extra on top. But if they couldn't pay, they'd just default. They'd break their promise. The lenders would lose their money, the king would get a bad reputation, and he'd have to find someone else to borrow from next time. It was a risky business for the lenders and pretty embarrassing for the royals. But the key thing is the system was contained. A debt was a temporary problem. It either got paid back or was wiped out. The slate was cleared. Then, a Scottish merchant named William Patterson changed everything. This guy was a bit of a financial schemer who had tried and failed over and over again to strike it rich. But in 1691, he came up with an idea so powerful it would reshape civilization itself. At the time, England was locked in a long and expensive war with France. King William III was desperate for cash. The royal treasury was empty. Taxes weren't bringing in enough to pay for the army, and all the usual lenders were saying, no way. Because England had a bad habit of not paying its debts. This is where Patterson saw his chance. He went to the king with a revolutionary proposal. He could raise £2 million, a staggering sum, worth hundreds of millions in today's money. But here was the unbelievable twist, the core of his innovation. The loan would never be repaid. That's right, instead of paying back the principal, the government would just pay interest on it forever. A steady 8% every single year, guaranteed. To manage this strange new arrangement, Patterson proposed creating a brand new institution, the Bank of England. The way it worked was a complete game changer. A group of wealthy merchants would give their gold to this new Bank of England. The bank would then turn around and lend that gold to the government. The government, in turn, would use its tax revenue to make that 8% interest payment to the bank every year. And finally, the bank would pass that interest along to the original merchant lenders. But here's the detail that changed the world. The government never ever had to pay back the original $2 million. The loan was permanent. It was less like a loan and more like a subscription service that the country could never cancel. Why on earth would the lenders agree to this? Because their interest payment was guaranteed by the full faith and credit of the English Parliament. It was backed by the government's power to tax its own citizens. It was the safest bet in the world. As long as England existed and could collect taxes, the bankers would get their money like clockwork. And the banknotes they got in return for their gold were basically golden tickets. They could be bought and sold, traded just like money. In fact, they were even better than money because they earned interest. Parliament loved the idea and approved Patterson's scheme in 1694. The Bank of England was born. The merchants handed over their gold, the government got the money for its war, and for the very first time in history, national debt stopped being a temporary problem to be solved and became a permanent feature of the system. For the bankers, this was pure genius. That £2 million loan generated £96,000 a year, every year, forever. They had essentially purchased a permanent income stream paid for by the taxpayers of England. But Patterson's true masterpiece was what came next. The newly formed Bank of England was also given the exclusive right to print paper money that was backed by the government's debt. Think about that. They could literally create new money out of thin air based on the government's IOU. The government's promise to pay became the foundation of the currency. This meant the more the government borrowed, the more money the bank could create. This is the blueprint for modern finance. The government borrows money it never intends to repay. It pays interest on that loan forever, using taxpayer money. And the debt itself is used as the basis to create even more money. It's an amazing deal if you're a banker, but it's a disaster if you're a taxpayer, because you are now paying interest on a loan that will never ever disappear. This idea was so powerful and so profitable that it spread like wildfire. Within 50 years, every major power in Europe had copied the model. And by 1790, even the brand new United States of America adopted the very same system, with Alexander Hamilton explicitly modeling America's finances on the Bank of England. William Patterson himself died in 1719, not a particularly rich man, but the system he designed, the permanent debt machine he built, is still running 331 years later. That bank William Patterson built, the Bank of England, it's still around today, and that original government debt, it has never, ever been paid off. Not once. It's been shuffled around, refinanced, rolled over into new loans, and expanded beyond anyone's wildest dreams. But it has never been eliminated. The debt trap was set all the way back in 1694, and it seems every government since then has walked right into it, almost willingly. By the early 1800s, governments all across Europe had fully embraced the idea of permanent debt. They borrowed money for everything, for fighting wars, for building roads and canals, even just to cover their day-to-day running costs. But the system was still a little clumsy. There wasn't an organized market for all this debt. Each loan was a separate deal, negotiated one-on-one. Interest rates were all over the place, and only the absolute wealthiest people could get in on the action. That all changed with our second architect, Nathan Rothschild. This man didn't just participate in the system, he supercharged it. He turned government debt into a massive global industry. The Rothschild family had started out as humble money changers in Frankfurt, Germany. But by 1800, the 5 Rothschild brothers had created a financial empire, with major banking houses in the 5 most important cities in Europe: London, Paris, Frankfurt, Vienna, and Naples. This network was their superpower. It was a pre-internet information superhighway, allowing them to move money and messages across borders faster and more secretly than any king or government. And they used this incredible advantage to completely dominate the business of government debt. Nathan, the brother stationed in London, was the strategic genius of the family. During the Napoleonic Wars, he was the go-to guy for financing the British war effort. But he came up with a new and brilliant way of doing it. Instead of just lending money directly to the government like everyone else, he acted as a middleman. He would buy up huge amounts of government bonds at a discount, and then he would turn around and resell those bonds to a whole new network of smaller investors at a higher price. He essentially created a marketplace. Think of it this way. The government needed cash immediately, and Rothschild gave it to them. Then he took their giant IOU, chopped it up into smaller, more affordable pieces, and sold those pieces to pension funds, insurance companies, and rich individuals all over Europe. The government got its money fast. Rothschild made a tidy profit on the difference, and investors got a safe, tradable piece of paper that paid them regular interest. But here's where the story takes a darker turn. Rothschild didn't just finance governments. He put himself in a position where governments had no other choice but to use him. The most famous example happened in 1815 at the epic Battle of Waterloo. Thanks to his incredible network of couriers, Nathan Rothschild learned that Napoleon had been defeated a full day before the official news reached London. He used this secret information to orchestrate one of the greatest financial plays in history. First, he started publicly selling his British government bonds. This sent a signal to the entire market that he, the great Nathan Rothschild, must know something terrible. The market panicked, thinking Britain had lost the war. Bond prices collapsed as everyone scrambled to sell. Then, once prices hit rock bottom, Rothschild secretly sent his agents in to buy up every single bond they could get their hands on for pennies on the dollar. The next day, when the official news of the British victory finally arrived, bond prices skyrocketed. Rothschild had made a fortune, not by building anything, but by controlling information and manipulating fear. This became the Rothschild model. Control the information, control the supply of money, and you control the market. By the 1820s, if a European government needed to borrow money, it had to go through the Rothschilds. Why? Because the Rothschilds controlled the network of investors. They had the distribution channels, and because of that, they got to set the terms. And here's why this was so critical for locking the debt trap shut. Before Rothschild, a king could, in theory, just refuse to pay his debts. It would be messy, his creditors would lose their money, but the system could reset. Rothschild changed that by making government debt an international spiderweb. A British bond might be owned by an investor in France who sold it to a bank in Germany, which then used it as collateral for a loan to a nobleman in Austria. The web of ownership became so tangled and complex that for a government to default was no longer an option. It wasn't about stiffing one creditor anymore. It would trigger a catastrophic collapse of the entire international financial network. It would be like pulling a single thread that causes the whole sweater of global finance to unravel. This was Rothschild's true innovation. He made default impossible, not because governments suddenly became more responsible, but because a default would cause a worldwide financial meltdown. Governments were now completely trapped. They had to keep making their interest payments, and they had to keep borrowing more new money just to pay the interest on their old debts. The debt trap wasn't just permanent anymore. Thanks to Nathan Rothschild, it was now inescapable. Now let's jump forward to the early 1900s. America was rising, becoming the world's new economic giant. But its financial system was still the Wild West. There was no central control. Banks were mostly independent, the money supply was clunky and tied to gold, and there was no big institution to manage the nation's debt. Our third architect, J.P. Morgan, was about to fix that, not for the good of the people, but to protect his own massive banking empire. In 1907, a huge financial panic hit the United States. The stock market crashed, banks started failing, and the entire economy was grinding to a halt. In this moment of crisis, J.P. Morgan personally stepped in and organized a bailout. Imagine this. He gathered all the most powerful bankers in New York, brought them to his private library, locked the doors, and basically refused to let them leave until they agreed to use their own money to prop up the failing banks and save the system. It worked. The panic subsided, and Morgan was hailed as a hero, the unofficial central banker of America. But Morgan was nearly 70 years old. He knew he couldn't play savior forever. He and his powerful friends realized they needed a permanent solution. They needed a central bank. The problem was, ordinary Americans were deeply suspicious of central banks. 2 previous versions had already been created and then shut down due to popular outrage. So Morgan's group knew they couldn't be direct. They had to be clever. They had to disguise it. In the fall of 1910, a group of Morgan's top associates, including a powerful senator and representatives from the biggest banks in the country, boarded a private train car for a secret trip to a secluded island off the coast of Georgia called Jekyll Island. For 9 straight days, in total secrecy, this small group of the nation's most powerful bankers hammered out the design for what would eventually become the Federal Reserve System. The reason for all the secrecy was simple. They knew that if the American public ever found out that a handful of Wall Street bankers were designing the nation's new monetary system in a private clubhouse, there would be riots in the streets. People would have been furious, and rightfully so. So the plan they hatched was an act of brilliant political camouflage. First, they knew they couldn't call it a central bank. That was a toxic phrase in America. Instead, they called it the Federal Reserve System, which sounds much more official and spread out. They also knew it couldn't be a single all-powerful building in Washington, D.C., so they designed it as 12 different regional banks scattered across the country. And to top it off, they made it look like it wasn't controlled by Wall Street at all. They set it up to be overseen by a board of governors, appointed by the president himself. On the surface, it all looked decentralized, democratic, and public, but that was just the packaging. The underlying structure was designed to ensure the bankers always held the real power. You see, those 12 regional Federal Reserve banks were actually privately owned, and their shareholders were the very commercial banks in their region. Those private banks have to elect the board of directors for their regional Fed, and the New York Fed, by far the most powerful of the 12, was controlled by the biggest banks on Wall Street, J.P. Morgan's banks. So, while the government got to appoint a few people at the top, the real machinery of the system, especially the critical power to create money and buy government debt, was firmly in the hands of the bankers. The Federal Reserve Act was cleverly pushed through Congress in December of 1913, at a time when many representatives had already gone home for the holidays, and most of those who remained didn't fully understand the complex bill they were voting for. And the moment it passed, the American debt trap expanded to a whole new level. Before, the government could only borrow money from existing banks. Now the government could borrow directly from its new partner, the Federal Reserve, which had been given the magical power to create new money out of thin air, specifically to buy government bonds. This created unlimited demand for government debt. Here's why that's so important. Before the Fed, there was a natural limit to how much the government could borrow. Banks only had so much money in their vaults to lend out. But the Federal Reserve didn't need vaults full of money. It could create it with a keystroke. The government issues a piece of paper called a bond, which is just an IOU. The Fed buys that bond using brand new money that didn't exist a second earlier. The government then gets to spend that new money, and the IOU, the debt, just sits on the Fed's balance sheet, backed by nothing more than a promise that future generations of taxpayers will work to pay the interest on it forever. This is the engine that makes infinite debt possible. The Federal Reserve guarantees that there will always be a buyer for government bonds. There is always demand, which means the government never has to face the music and stop borrowing. It can just roll over its debt again and again and again, because the Fed will always be there to buy it. And all that interest, it flows from the taxpayers, through the government, and into the pockets of the very banks that own the Federal Reserve System. J.P. Morgan died in 1913, the very same year his creation came to life. But his true legacy is the financial architecture that makes America's current $38 trillion debt a reality. Without the Federal Reserve, the government simply could not borrow on this unimaginable scale. The market would never allow it. But with the Fed acting as a guaranteed buyer of last resort, there's no limit. The debt trap became infinite. By the 1970s, the trap designed by Patterson, industrialized by Rothschild, and perfected by Morgan was operating on a global scale. Every developed country in the world was doing the same thing, borrowing money, rolling over the debt, and paying endless interest. But the situation was different for poorer developing nations. They had borrowed billions of dollars to build dams, roads, and factories, but many of them were struggling to keep up with the payments. The debt trap was starting to show signs of strain. It was reaching its limits. And that's when our fourth architect, Paul Volcker, stepped in and made the trap truly global and permanent. Volcker was the chairman of the Federal Reserve from 1979 to 1987, and he walked into a mess. Inflation in the United States was out of control, soaring above 10% a year. America's economic credibility was shot, and other countries were starting to lose faith in the US dollar. Volcker knew he had to do something drastic to stop inflation, even if it meant throwing the economy into a painful recession. So, in 1979, he did the unthinkable. He jacked up interest rates to levels no one had ever seen before. The main interest rate went from around 11% all the way up to a shocking 20%. This move, known as the Volcker shock, successfully crushed inflation in the US, but it had a devastating side effect that rippled across the globe. All those developing nations in Latin America, Africa, and Asia had borrowed billions of US dollars back when interest rates were low. Now, suddenly, the interest payments on their loans had doubled or even tripled overnight. Mexico owed $80 billion. Brazil owed $60 billion. They simply couldn't pay. The interest payments alone were more than they were earning from all their exports combined. In August of 1982, the first domino fell. Mexico announced to the world that it could no longer make its debt payments. It was going to default. This single announcement should have triggered a complete global financial meltdown. The biggest American banks, Citibank, Bank of America, Chase, had lent most of that money. If Mexico and other countries defaulted, these banks would have faced catastrophic losses. Some might have even gone bankrupt, bringing the entire system down with them. Volcker had a choice. He could have let it happen. He could have let the banks fail for making risky loans, let the market cleanse itself, but he didn't. Instead, he, along with the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, organized a massive bailout. The IMF would lend countries like Mexico and Brazil just enough new money to do one thing: keep making their interest payments to the big American banks. These weren't get-out-of-jail-free cards. They were called structural adjustment loans, and they came with brutal conditions. In exchange for the bailout money, these countries were forced to slash spending on things like healthcare and education, sell off their public assets like water and electricity companies to foreign corporations, and essentially hand over control of their economies. And here is the cruel genius of the Volcker innovation. The IMF loans didn't actually reduce the total amount of debt these countries owed. They just repackaged it, kicked the can down the road, and made the debt permanent. In doing so, he transformed the debt trap from a simple financial mechanism into a powerful tool of political and economic control. When a country's debt becomes unpayable, you don't forgive it. You restructure it, lend them just enough to keep the interest flowing, and in exchange, you get to dictate their national policies. The trap was now complete. So now, countries that found themselves unable to pay were forced to sell off their most valuable assets, open up their economies to foreign control, and basically surrender their right to make their own decisions, all for the privilege of staying in debt. This exact pattern has been repeated over and over again for the last 40 years. We saw it in Argentina in 2001, in Greece in 2010, and in Sri Lanka in 2022. Every single time, the playbook is the same. The IMF steps in with new loans, but only enough to keep the interest payments flowing to the big banks. In return, the country has to endure brutal cuts to public services, a process they call austerity. The nation's sovereignty is sacrificed, but the debt is never ever eliminated. It's just restructured, repackaged, and made perpetual. Paul Volcker passed away in 2019, but his legacy is the global mechanism that ensures the debt trap is not only inescapable, but also a tool of control. Because of his innovation, Even when countries mathematically cannot pay, they are not allowed to default and start over. Instead, they are simply refinanced into a state of permanent indebtedness. And through it all, the interest just keeps flowing upward to the same international creditors, the same big banks, the same powerful institutions, all part of the same basic system that William Patterson first dreamed up all the way back in 1694. So let's take a step back and see how these four architects, step by step, built the perfect, inescapable machine. First, you start with William Patterson's brilliant and simple model. The government borrows money but never has to repay the original amount, only the interest, forever. Then, you add Nathan Rothschild's innovation, make that debt tradable all over the world. Turn it into a complex international web, so it's not just one person you owe, it's everyone. This makes defaulting so dangerous that it would collapse the entire global financial system. Then, you layer on JP Morgan's mechanism, create a central bank, with the power to print money out of thin air specifically to buy government bonds. This creates unlimited demand, ensuring the government can always borrow more. Finally, you add Paul Volcker's masterstroke. When a country inevitably gets trapped and can't pay, don't forgive the debt. Instead, restructure it with new loans that come with strings attached, forcing them to surrender control in exchange for staying trapped, all while keeping the interest payments flowing. The result of these four innovations is the world we live in today. A world with $315 trillion in global debt, that's government debt, corporate debt, and household debt, all rolled into one giant, terrifying number. And here's the secret. None of it is ever meant to be repaid. All of it is designed to pay interest. And all of it is so deeply interconnected through the global financial system that a default anywhere threatens a catastrophic collapse everywhere. Let's look at how it works in the United States with its $38 trillion debt. Who actually owns all that debt? Well, about $20 trillion is owned by the American public and institutions. We're talking about your pension fund, your 401k, insurance companies, and banks. They all buy U.S. Treasury bonds because they're considered the safest investment on earth. But those bonds pay interest, about $1 trillion a year right now. And where does that $1 trillion come from? It comes from your taxes. So ordinary working taxpayers send their money to the government. The government immediately sends a huge chunk of it right back out to the institutions that hold the bonds, which are mostly owned by the wealthiest people. It's a massive, continuous transfer of wealth from labor to capital, happening every single year, forever. The other $18 trillion is money the government owes to itself, in a kind of accounting trick. It borrowed from programs like Social Security and Medicare. But ultimately, the taxpayers are still on the hook, because when those programs need the money back, the government will have to either raise taxes or borrow even more money to pay them. It's a shell game, but no matter which shell the ball is under, the interest payments keep flowing. Now, zoom out and apply this model to the entire planet. Japan owes $9 trillion, mostly to its own banks and the central bank. Europe owes $14 trillion, mostly to European banks and their central bank. Everyone is running the same playbook, and they are all tangled together. Japan owns a huge amount of U.S. debt. America, through institutions like the IMF, holds European debt. Europe holds the debt of developing nations. It's a completely circular system where everyone owes everyone else, but the one constant is that the interest on all this debt always flows upward to the giant financial institutions that manage the system. And here's the final mind-bending reason why this can never end. If, by some miracle, the U.S. government paid off all $38 trillion of its debt, our economy would instantly collapse. Why? Because in our system, money is created when the government borrows. If that debt were to be paid off, those dollars would literally vanish from the system. We would experience a deflationary depression that would make the 1930s look like a party. The same is true globally. If every government paid off its debt, the world's money supply would shrink by more than 2/3. There wouldn't be enough money in circulation to even conduct basic trade. The entire global economy would seize up and die. So, you see, the debt can't be eliminated. It is a structural and necessary feature of the system's design. And who profits from this inescapable cycle? The giant institutions that hold all the debt. Firms like BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. These massive asset managers control tens of trillions of dollars. They use other people's money, from pension funds, retirement accounts, and insurance policies, to buy up government bonds from all over the world. And they collect the interest. From U.S. debt alone, that's $1 trillion a year, plus all the interest from Japan, Europe, and everywhere else. That money flows directly from taxpayers to these bondholders. It is the single largest and most persistent transfer of wealth in human history. And it's invisible to most people because it's not called a tax. It's called debt service. But it's the same thing. Working people pay, and the institutions at the top collect. Now, to be clear, these four architects didn't all sit in a room and conspire together. They lived in different centuries. But each one of them faced a specific problem, and each one solved it in a way that just so happened to benefit the banking class, building upon the work of the one before him. Patterson made debt permanent. Rothschild made it global. Morgan made it infinite. And Volcker made it inescapable. Together, across 300 years, they built the perfect system, where governments are born to borrow and taxpayers are born to pay the interest forever. And in this grand design, the people who control the bonds, who manage the global flow of debt, and who sit back and collect the endless stream of interest, they are the ultimate winners, not the governments, who are merely perpetual borrowers, and certainly not the taxpayers, who are the ones actually footing the bill. The real beneficiaries are the financial institutions at the very top of the pyramid. And this brings us to the final, most important truth of all. That $38 trillion number you hear on the news, it isn't a crisis for them. It's not a bug in the system. It's their entire business model. You have to understand that every single dollar of debt is also an asset on someone else's balance sheet. Your mortgage is your debt, but it's a money-making asset for your bank. In the same way, the government's massive debt is a gigantic income-generating asset for the institutions that own it. It pays them interest year after year. It provides them with rock-solid collateral they can use to borrow even more money. The debt isn't the problem. For them, the debt is the product. As long as the system holds together, as long as people continue to have confidence that governments will keep collecting taxes to pay the interest, even if everyone secretly knows the principal can never be repaid, the machine keeps humming along. The debt trap is complete. It is a perfectly designed, self-perpetuating system. And a real escape? It's not really possible, not without deliberately choosing to collapse the entire global financial house of cards and starting over from scratch. 4 architects, working across 3 centuries, built one incredible system. And now, every single person on Earth, whether they know it or not, is caught inside of it. If this has changed the way you think about government debt, if you've had that light bulb moment and finally understand that these massive, scary numbers aren't the result of an accident or a mistake, but are the sign of a system working exactly as it was designed, then you're beginning to see how power really works in our world. Subscribe if you want to keep pulling back the curtain to understand how this machine was really built and who is sitting at the controls. Because I promise you, they are not going to teach you this in your high school economics class. They're going to tell you that debt is a problem that needs to be solved. But the architects, the men who built this world, they knew better. They knew debt wasn't the problem at all. It's the foundation of their control. And all that interest we pay, generation after generation, that's simply the rent we are all forced to pay for the privilege of living in their system.